Watcher, and welcome to Said Serio and the third episode of Designing and Building an Electric Guitar. In this episode, I'll be gluing together the main body blank for the electric guitar build. One of my aims for this guitar is to build it entirely from wood sourced in the UK. I think when you build with wood, you should at least give some thought to the source of your materials. If at all possible, it makes sense to me to avoid using wood that's been needlessly felled out in an Amazonian rainforest and shipped halfway around the world. With that in mind, I started looking for a good luthier supplier who would be able to supply wood from closer by. So I got in touch with a company called David Dyke Luthier Supplies, who are at luthiersupplies.co.uk, and asked what they could provide. And they actually had a really good selection of stuff in stock from the UK. What I have chosen for the main body of this build then is a big two-piece slab of horse chestnut, aka the tree that gives us conkers in autumn. Now, I'm filming this after having already glued the blank together, but for my design it was a bit wide, so I needed to get quite a large slab of wood. So this was, I think, penciled for a bass guitar blank, but big solid piece of wood that should be fairly easy to machine and should sound nice as a guitar. Now the guitar is going to incorporate a glued on back rather than a top, and this will be made from two joined pieces of slightly flamed sycamore, which is a relative of the US and Canadian maple tree, which often gets used for glued on tops and guitar necks. So we've got two lightly flamed pieces here. It's not the way it should be matched. Okay. The neck will also be made from flamed sycamore, while the fretboard will be made from laburnum, which is also known as the golden chain tree. The laburnum has been fumed to give it a darker colour, as in its natural state it's quite light. I wanted it to look similar to rosewood rather than a kind of light maple looking fretboard. But those two together should be quite a nice combination, and it's nice to know that you can build a guitar neck from wood sourced in the UK. So my first step was to join and glue the main body blank. Although I hadn't ordered it jointed, it arrived nearly ready to go. Holding the two pieces together, you could just about make out a thin slither of light here and there. To get the two faces of wood joining correctly, I taped some 120 grit sandpaper onto a flat surface, marked the joining edges with a pencil, and sanded away the high spots until I couldn't see any more light through the join. They're quite heavy slabs, and whilst holding them up to the light, I did manage to drop them on my face at one point and nearly knocked a tooth out. This is definitely something to avoid if at all possible. With the two pieces jointed and ready to glue, I did a quick test with my clamps to make sure it would all kind of go together smoothly. Next, I applied a thin and even layer of wood glue. I used Tight Bond here because I've read that that seems to be people's favourites to use for this kind of application, and proceeded to clamp together the wood with some sash clamps and some G-clamps. And it turned out my thin and even layer of glue was actually a bit too much glue, and it was a bit of an old mess, but once it's set, it cleaned up okay. With the body blank glued together successfully, I had to think about getting it down to the correct depth. I should probably ask the supplier to do this for me for the £10 or so they would have charged, but doing it myself was a good opportunity to put together this router jig, which I can use to flatten pieces of wood. Made entirely from a sheet of 18mm MDF, the router attaches to the sled with a couple of wing nuts, and I can add and remove spacers depending on the thickness of the wood to be flattened. I'm using a 2-inch bottom cleaning router bit here with a 1/2-inch shank, and it's a big scary chunk of metal when it's rotating really quickly. I had to remove just over 1 centimetre of material from the body blank in total, which I did in several passes. Before calculating the final depth required, I realised that I should also glue up the sycamore back, so I could also take that depth into account. I had to remove nearly half the depth of the sycamore back after I subsequently clumsily rushed the glue up of that. This has resulted in a slightly thinner back and slightly thicker body blank than I thought I would be using, but the guitar will still be 35mm in depth. With some final sanding left to remove the marks left from the routing, the body blank and the separate back are now ready for the next stage of the build, which is cutting out the body shape. Before I end this episode, some friends have asked for a quick tour of my workspace, which is the dusty old cellar in my house. Humidity is something to keep an eye on when building anything with wood, so I don't leave wood destined for the guitar down there. The main storage here is two 7-foot workbenches, which were really great fun getting down into the cellar. I'm slowly amassing the tools I need for each step to keep the costs under control. So far, this has included this used Triton oscillating spindle sander, which was really awesome for helping to shape the guitar templates. I also bought a used Titan bandsaw and fitted a new tough saw blade. It's a completely entry-level machine, but it's been just fine for me so far. The real test will be when cutting the body blank to shape. I did want a table saw, but everything at the cheap end of the scale looks flimsy and dangerous. So instead, I have this plunge saw and track. I use this for both rip cuts and cross cuts, and whilst it's more time consuming to set up than a table saw would be, it is a lot less scary to use. Finally, I have this Triton router, which, although small, accepts up to 1/2 inch Shank router bits and has a handy height adjustment feature. This is currently mounted onto my wood flattening jig, but will also be table mounted in the future to do some flush trimming. I have this cheap shop vac and a cyclone for dust removal. It's not the prettiest setup, but it works pretty well. Then I have various old odds and ends of tools dotted around. Lots that I've nicked from my parents over the years. Some clamps, some masking tape and super glue, which is really handy. Some safety equipment and a radio to keep me company. I will need plenty of more specialist tools as I go through each stage of the build, but this is it for now. So then, thanks for joining me for this episode. Next time I hope to have the pieces of wood looking more guitar shaped for you. Until then, take care and I hope to see you next time.